What if I told you the bass and drum tracks on Ozzy's first 2 solo albums were secretly erased? That the 2 men who wrote the music for Crazy Train, Flying High Again, were fired by an accountant and replaced on the album cover by guys who didn't play a note. And when they finally sued for millions in unpaid royalties, the response was not a check, it was deletion. Here's how the Blizzard of Ozz became a cold-blooded business. So in 1979, Ozzy Osbourne was a dead man walking. He had just been fired from Black Sabbath, the band he co-founded, and the reason was simple. He was a catastrophic, unmanageable mess of booze and drugs. 30 years old, holed up in the Park Hotel in LA, and was fully prepared to drink and drug himself to death. His management, Jet Records, which was run by the infamous Don Arden, had essentially given up on him. But Don's daughter, Sharon, saw something. She saw a commodity, not a lost cause. So she flew to LA, took over his management from her dad, got him out of the hotel, told him to get his act together. They're going to build a solo career. So the first thing Ozzy did was find a writing partner. He was hanging out in LA where he met a bass player named Bob Daisley. Bob wasn't some kid, he was a pro, having just been kicked out of Rainbow, which was Ritchie Blackmore's band. He was a serious player and, more importantly, songwriter. Ozzy and Bob hit it off. And this wasn't going to be the Ozzy Osbourne solo project. They decided right then and there it was going to be a band. A whole band with its own name, Blizzard of Ozz. So kind of a solo band, because it featured Oz, but I digress. Bob Daisley was the anchor. He knew Ozzy was still a mess and needed a miracle. And he found one in a young, quiet guitarist named Randy Rhoads. Randy was a local LA kid, brilliant player, teaching guitar, playing in a local band called Quiet Riot. He was a small dude, really quiet, total genius, trained in classical guitar, and he was also tired of the club scene. Randy came into audition with just a little practice amp. Ozzy, who was half passed out on the couch, heard him start to warm up and immediately said, "You got the gig." Bob and Randy clicked immediately. They started writing riffs. They needed a drummer, a real powerhouse. Bob knew a guy. He called out Lee Kerslake. Lee was a heavy hitter, a legend who had just left the band Uriah Heep. So now the lineup was set. Ozzy on vocals, Randy on guitar, Bob on bass, Lee on drums. This was a band of equals, or at least that's what Bob and Lee thought. They all moved into a house together in England, a Ridge Farm studio in Surrey, and started writing. And the roles became clear very fast. Randy Rhoads would show up with a pile of monster riffs, just bags of them. Bob and Lee, the rhythm section, would jam with him, arranging the parts, finding the grooves, building the song structures. Lee, with his jazz-influenced background, gave the music kind of that swing and bounce that other hard rock and metal bands did not have. And Ozzy, he couldn't play an instrument, so he would listen to the completed tracks, hum melodies over the top. But now what about the lyrics? Who wrote the words? Fans might think Ozzy wrote Crazy Train. He did not. Bob Daisley wrote every single word. Mr. Crowley? All Bob. I don't know? All Bob again. Controversial Suicide Solution became a huge problem later on. It got Ozzy sued by parents who claimed the song encouraged their son to do the unthinkable. Ozzy would later claim that he wrote the title about the death of AC/DC's Bon Scott, with solution meaning the liquid alcohol that killed him. But Bob Daisley tells a different story. He says he wrote the lyrics about Ozzy as a direct warning to his friend who was quite literally drinking himself to death. The foursome as a unit wrote the entire Blizzard of Ozz album. They went into the studio with producer Max Norman and knocked it out. The chemistry was electric. The result was a masterpiece. The album flew off the shelves, saving Ozzy's career and putting him right back on top. The label, Jet Records, started marketing it as Ozzy Osbourne's Blizzard of Ozz, and then just Ozzy Osbourne, putting his name front and center. The quote-unquote band idea was already being erased for the public, but not for the guys in the group. They toured relentlessly. They were a gang. Bob and Lee felt that they had made it. They're part of the next big thing. After the tour, the label wanted another album. Fast, no break. So the same exact 4 guys went right back in the studio, and they did it all again. They wrote Diary of a Madman. The magic was still there. Songs like Over the Mountain, Flying High Again, lyrics by Daisley, were just as strong, or maybe even stronger, because they were a well-oiled machine and not a lot of time had gone by between the albums. They finished the record and were proud of their work. They delivered 2 classic albums in just over a year. Then came the crap. In 1981, just as Diary of a Madman was being mixed, Bob Daisley and Lee Kerslake were in England, and they were told by management to be ready to fly back to the U.S. to start tour rehearsals. They were packing their bags, waiting for their plane ticket. The plane tickets never came. Instead, they get a call from an accountant. Not Ozzy, not Sharon, just some accountant. The message was simple. Sorry guys, your services are no longer needed here. No explanation, no thanks for the work, just see ya. Bob and Lee were stunned. This was their band. They had written the song. They had played every note. How could they be fired? Well, they soon found out. Sharon had already hired a new rhythm section. Bassist Rudy Sarzo, friend of Randy's from the Quiet Riot days, drummer Tommy Aldrich. So when Diary of a Madman hit the stores, Bob and Lee were horrified. On the back cover, posing with Ozzy and Randy, were Sarzo and Tommy Aldrich. Their picture. Their names were listed as the band members. Bob Daisley and Lee Kerslake's names were buried deep in the credits in tiny, tiny print, alongside the road crew and the caterers. Rudy Sarzo later said that he was embarrassed by that whole thing. He wrote in his book Off the Rails that he felt terrible about it. He knew he hadn't played a single note on the record. He said it was a management decision, and he was just the new guy trying to keep the gig, so he went along with it. This was the first erasure. The new band, Sarzo and Aldridge, went on a massive world tour, playing arenas, playing the songs that Bob and Lee had written and recorded. Meanwhile, Bob and Lee were sitting at home, broke, had not been paid properly for the first album. Now they're getting nothing for the second. And here's the thing. They had signed contracts, but the contracts weren't with Jet Records. They had signed them with Blizzard of Ozz, a production company, which was owned by, you guessed it, Ozzy. Managed by, you guessed it, Sharon. It was a neat little trick. It meant that they were, on paper, just employees. Work for hire. Hired hands that can be thrown away. That's always a favorite pastime, just for them to take employees and throw them away. So in 1982, the tragedy of Randy Rhoads' death in a plane crash put everything on hold. But the business machine kept on rolling. And here's where it gets really weird. 1983, Ozzy needed to make a new album, Bark at the Moon. And who did they call? Bob Daisley. They brought him back. So Bob, of course, needing the work, agreed. He comes in, plays bass on the entire album, wrote the majority of the lyrics, again. And what happened? He was let go. Again. Like Lucy in the football. The album came out, and the writing credit said all songs written by Ozzy Osbourne. Bob's name was nowhere this time. He was offered a buyout for his publishing rights, which he refused. This led to another lawsuit, which Bob eventually won, but not for years. Bob and Lee had enough. They filed a lawsuit in 1986 against Ozzy and Jet Records for unpaid performance royalties, proper songwriting credits. They argued that they were co-authors of the songs in the first two albums, not just session players. The legal battles dragged on for years. It was a nasty, bitter fight. The Osbournes' position was clear. Blizzard of Ozz was never a band. It was always a solo project. Daisley and Kerslake were just musicians for hire. The courts, unfortunately, agreed with the Osbournes, and the case was dismissed in the late 90s. Bob and Lee were left with nothing but legal bills, but they kept fighting. They filed another lawsuit, this time for millions in unpaid performance royalties, the money they were owed as the actual musicians who played on two of the biggest selling heavy metal albums of all time. By 2002, Sharon Osbourne was at the peak of her power. The Osbournes on MTV was a huge show. Ozzy was a lovable, bumbling TV dad, but behind the scenes, the lawsuit from Daisley and Kerslake was a persistent, irritating problem. The back catalog was due for a reissue. Sharon saw this opportunity not just to win, but to annihilate. She decided to make Bob Daisley and Lee Kerslake disappear, for good. She called up Ozzy's then bassist, Robert Trujillo, who would later join Metallica, drummer Mike Borden from Faith No More. Their instructions were cold and clear. Go in the studio and re-record every single bass and drum track for Blizzard of Ozz and Diary of a Madman, not as a bonus track or a modern update. They were literally hired to replace the original performances. The original 1980 master tapes, the DNA of the classic albums, were pulled. Bob Daisley's iconic melodic bass lines, wiped. Lee Kerslake's thundering, swinging drum parts, erased. Trujillo and Borden, both professional and talented players, did the job they were paid to do. In the spring of 2002, the remastered editions of Blizzard of Ozz and Diary of a Madman were released. On the back, a new note was added. The bass and drum tracks on this album have been re-recorded. Fans are like, what the hell's going on? They put the CDs in their players and the sound was just wrong. The opening riff of Crazy Train kicked in, but the bass line felt kind of sterile. Drum fills on Over the Mountain had no swing or life. The groove was just gone. This was not the album they grew up with. It was a cold, digital copy. Backlash, immediate and brutal. Fan forums and music magazines lit up. It's not a remaster, it was like a vandalism. Revisionist history. People called Sharon Scrooge, accusing her of robbing the original musicians of their legacy out of pure spite. Ozzy himself tried to distance himself from it. In one interview, he claimed Bob and Lee were always moaning and had their chance. In another, he blamed it all on Sharon, saying, to be honest with you, I didn't know it was being done. I didn't know. A man who apparently doesn't listen to the re-releases of his most famous albums. Sharon, however, was defiant. She openly admitted that she did it. She told the press that Daisley and Kerslake were whiners and negative and had been bad-mouthing Ozzy. She said flat out that she wasn't going to pay royalties to people who were suing us. She said Robert and Mike did a fabulous job, but the fans did not agree. The 2002 reissues became a notorious joke in the metal community, basically a symbol of corporate greed and disrespect. For 9 long years, these fake versions were the only ones you could buy. Imagine that. If you want to hear the real Blizzard of Ozz, you had to find used 80s vinyl or an original 95 CD pressing, or of course cassettes, whatever you could get your hands on. The Osbournes had effectively erased Daisley and Kerslake from their own history. But the backlash never died down, it just got louder. But finally, in 2011, for the 30th anniversary of the albums, the Osbourne camp caved. A new press release announced that both Blizzard of Ozz and Diary of a Madman would be re-released. This time, the original, untouched 1980 recordings of Bob Daisley and Lee Kerslake were fully restored. Ozzy's son, Jack, even went on Twitter to call the 2002 versions a mistake and wrong. Ozzy gave interviews saying he was thrilled to have the originals back, again implying that it was all a record company decision that he had no part in. Sharon, she stayed quiet. Bob Daisley and Lee Kerslake, however, saw it differently. They were glad the music was back, but they still had not gotten their money. Their lawsuit for royalties had been dismissed. In the years before he died of cancer in 2020, Lee Kerslake was in very poor health. He made a public plea, not for the money. He just wanted the Osbournes to send him the platinum album plaques for Blizzard of Ozz and Diary albums that he co-wrote and played on, so he could hang them on his wall before he died. To this day, 2 of the 3 men responsible for one of the greatest comebacks in rock history, men who wrote and performed on albums that sold millions, reportedly never seen the performance royalties they believe that they are owed. Hit that subscribe button. Hit the like button. Join the family. To my subscribers, you frickin' rock. To my patrons, you frickin' rock. Thank you so much for watching.